Cool. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third event of the annual Green Week. This year, run in collaboration between the Cambridge SU Ethical Affairs and BME campaigns. We put in a lot of work into organizing this week, and we're so excited to be joined today by some incredible speakers for the event. You can find more info about all the events coming up this week on our Facebook page, which Daisy is going to share in the chat. Tonight, we're going to be discussing how the struggle against the climate crisis is a struggle against racism and colonialism, and how we can articulate and build an abolitionist vision for climate justice. We'll be speaking with Nialetti and Anjali from Choked Up and Joshua from Black Lives Matter UK. We'll be discussing how pollution, like prisons or police, is a form of state-sanctioned racism, which places minoritized communities in closer proximity to harm and death. And we'll be spotlighting the work of activists who are campaigning, organizing, agitating, advocating for a livable world, and to build a just future where every life is valued, protected, and nurtured. So I'm just going to say a very few brief words about our speakers for today before kind of letting them say a bit more about who they are and what they do. So first, we're joined by Nialetti and Anjali, who are the co-founders of Choked Up. Choked Up is a group of Black and Brown teens living in communities affected by air pollution. It was started with the aim of campaigning for the right to breathe clean air to be enshrined in law after the death of 9-year-old Ella Adu-Kisi-Deborah, which was the first in the UK to be officially attributed by a coroner to air pollution. We're also really excited to be joined by Joshua Varasamy, who is an artist. He's the author of How to Change It and Make a Difference by Murky Books, and a Black Lives Matter UK activist. BLM UK has been at the forefront of recent mass mobilizations against racism here in the UK, but of course, its work goes back many years. For example, in 2016, BLM UK shut down London City Airport to protest against its proposed expansion and to draw attention to the effects of air pollution on Black and Brown communities. So its work goes back many years. So I'm just gonna kind of give kind of each speaker a bit of time to speak about themselves and their work. So Nialetti and Anjali, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here today. We're really excited. So I'm Anjali, and so I'm just going to tell you a bit about myself. And so I personally live in a polluted area and have grown up around air pollution. So I live right by the South Circular, which is an extremely busy road in London. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to campaign on clean air. I also attended primary school with Ella Adu-Kisi-Deborah, so seeing her mum's fight for justice and knowing the effect that air pollution can firsthand have on communities also inspired me to start campaigning and also look at this issue under a different lens. So I started to look at it through a race lens as well, because the area that I live in is a very ethnically diverse neighborhood, and obviously Ella herself was a person of color. So knowing about this and seeing how this issue was affecting my neighborhood, which was predominantly people of color, I started to realize more about the justice aspect of environmentalism and how it didn't affect everyone equally. And this is one of the big principles behind Choked Up, the campaign that me and Nialetti started along with 2 other sixth formers. Yeah, so Nialetti.
Thank you, Anjali, and thank you for having us. So my name's Nialetti, I'm 17, I'm from Southeast London, and like Anjali, I live in a heavily polluted area. So what led me to co-found Choked Up with, along with Anjali and 2 others, is I was very struck by the omission of Black and Brown voices in the environment campaign. As many of you will know, the Fridays for Future marches gained a lot of traction in 2018 and 2019. And I was really struck by how issues that I saw affecting my community, like air pollution, which were in a very immediate and real sense, were being sidelined and not acknowledged. So I think with Choked Up, we'd really like to amplify the voices of Black people and people of colour, and add to the climate movement. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the main aims that we have is to create a new Clean Air Act. So this is a long-term goal that we have, and obviously under the current political climate with it's going to be hard to achieve this. So we've started, so we've broadened this slightly to try and strengthen clean air policy. So the new environment bill, issues such as this. So we specifically want to tackle clean air in like a just and equitable way that puts people of colour at the front of the movement, as we know it's an issue that disproportionately affects us. And we feel that the environment movement currently, as Nialetti has touched on, like overlooks this fact and focuses on environment in a way that kind of ignores a lot of the disproportional effects of it and focuses mainly on it through the white lens and acts as if we're all in the same situation when it's very clear that we're not, and there are people who are affected by this far more than others, and this is something that we feel really must be acknowledged in our approach to environmental issues. And so air pollution does disproportionately affect communities of colour, as people of colour and poorer people tend to live by busier roads and in more polluted areas. And so we really want to raise awareness of this, as people tend not to know about this issue. And actually, when we've been campaigning on it, we've been getting lots of comments which are saying stuff like, oh, how does air pollution know your race? Everyone wants to make stuff about race these days. And it's like, no, this is true. This is a proven fact. We know that people of colour are more exposed to air pollution, and this is simply not right, and we have to talk about this. And so without talking about environmental racism and without talking about how people of colour are affected differently by environmental issues, we are limiting our potential for success, and we are ignoring a key issue within the environmental movement. And this simply cannot stand, and we're excluding people of colour from our activism. And this is something that we really, really want to change. And we want to start giving a voice to people of colour within this movement and raising awareness for this, as we have been historically left out of the movement, and our issues have been overlooked. And we really want to change this.
So in terms of our big long-term aims, as has already been mentioned, we would really like the creation of a new Clean Air Act that is very comprehensive and very strict in clean air laws, and deals with air pollution solutions in an equitable way. But the current government seems less than willing to acknowledge this. So we would like to see in the current environment bill, which has actually been delayed, we would like to see WHO targets at the very least incorporated to ensure that air is protected. And in London, in the mayoral elections, we would really like candidates to focus on the importance of strong clean air policies, such as expanding ULEZ, and as well as that, acknowledging the disparities of clean air and actually putting that at the forefront of their messaging, as we feel that this is really not talked about enough. And yeah, so we'll be campaigning in the helping to campaign in the mayoral elections in the next few weeks. So please do keep an eye out for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali and Nialetti. Joshua, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Cool. I have a tendency to speak quite fast, so if I speak too fast, just be like, yo, slow down. And I'll try to slow down. All right. 1 second. All right, so I guess first of all, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss this really important question. How can our work towards abolition incorporate climate justice and vice versa? And it feels especially pertinent now that there's more kind of conversations around abolition, around the police, and around what it means to, for example, defund the police, as well as kind of heightened conversations around climate change and climate justice. So I'm going to speak less about myself and more about kind of where my head is at when I'm thinking about climate justice, and when I'm thinking about anti-racism, and when I'm thinking about abolition and other things. So this is, I'm going to kind of maybe walk you a bit through my thinking process around this and how I think these issues are connected. So I recently did a talk about love and anti-capitalism, which was a peculiar thing to get asked to talk about, because I'm like, I don't really say that much about love, but anyway, I did it. And in it, I recorded an interview with someone that I'd done recently where they asked me what Black liberation, which for me is part of the abolitionist vision, looks like. And I said that I couldn't really kind of comment, or I couldn't possibly comment on the shape or kind of flavor of this imagined place, Black liberation, that we fight for. But in many ways, it's a process we create. And what I feel certain about is that that place that we're fighting for and that we think we're going to arrive at is a return to love. And I continued with reading out a quote from Bell Hooks, who's this really incredible Black feminist and scholar. And she has a book called All About Love. And she opens with these words, and I'll read them out. She says, "I feel our nations are turning away from love, moving into a wilderness so intense we may never find our home again. A right of love to bear witness both to the danger in this movement and to call for a return to love." This love she calls for us to return to me feels especially important, because, like I said, there's this ascending kind of exploration and the politics and organizing of abolition. And because love, for me, and I like to start with something a bit more positive, and I'm going to try and be a bit affirmative about what we're fighting for in this talk as well, because love is a radically humanizing recognition of equality and shared experience, and is so clearly counterposed to the dehumanizing thrust of the carceral state that we talk about when we're talking about abolition, this kind of repressive, violent apparatus of the nation state. Black Lives Matter is in many ways for me a fight to return to love. And it's a radically humanizing love, but it's also a force which asserts it's also a love and a force which asserts the more than human rights of Mother Earth. So Black Lives Matter activists have always had our hearts on the front line of climate struggle, whether that's with Native communities in the US or communities in the Pacific, or here, where Howard alluded to, we did an action around airport expansion that threatens working class migrant communities. This year is also 30 years, sorry, one sec. This year is 30 years since the first National People of Color Summit on Environmental Justice, which was a really important summit. And as such, I kind of go back to the declaration and their kind of principles that they spoke about 30 years ago whenever I think about climate justice. And so I want to read their opening declaration, as I think it has a lot to offer us in thinking around anti-racism, abolition as a positive vision in climate justice. So it opens and they say, it's crazy to think it's 30 years ago. "We, the people of color, gathered together at this multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit to begin to build a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities, do hereby re-establish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of Mother Earth, to respect and celebrate each of our cultures, languages, and beliefs about the natural world and our roles in healing ourselves, to ensure environmental justice, to promote economic alternatives which would contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and to secure our political, economic, and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our peoples." This is a vision of radical love for me, a vision of Black liberation in action, a return to the sanctity against the loveless forces of capitalism. Abolition, the return to love, the making of peace with the earth, the seeing it with new eyes, seeing our relationships and our relationships of harm with new eyes, feels like a good starting point for me. when thinking through abolition and climate justice. However, it is important to acknowledge, as you guys from Chalked Up just did, that we do live in a loveless world, a very loveless world. And so maybe I'll pause here and take stock on the kind of lovelessness of the forces we're talking about, which recreate race and recreate the destruction of the environment, namely neoliberalism. So my father migrated to England in 1969, and my mother in 1989, and I was born in 1990 onto the estate that we lived on for several years in West London, Isleworth, on a tower block. Nearby, that area of London, actually, similarly to yourself, Anjali, it has very high levels of pollution. It's like 5 times the legal limit. It reaches the 5 times the legal limit within a few months of the year for Europe. But we were also next to one of the largest sewage treatment works in England. It's called Mogden Sewage Treatment Works. And we kind of lived our whole life with this constant stink around the community. And actually in 2001, complainants won a court judgment that the company had failed since 1990, so when I was born, to adequately manage the odor and thereby violated human rights. And a cash payout was made actually. So that they fought against that and they won. And the point here is that this tower block was predominantly, it housed predominantly migrant communities. And for me, it's an illustration of how race is always a determining factor on where toxic waste facilities are sited and situated. Like I said, that tower block historically houses working class communities, and in particular migrant working class communities, and they were sacrificed. This intersection where environmental degradation and injustice and racial injustice meets is, of course, not just accidental, it's more like a dependency, right? In order for European industrialists to have colonized the very same countries these migrants came from, they had to both destroy the land and the human relationship to it. And this is not history, and I think this is why we're having this conversation today. Like, this is not just like history in the past and how these things happened before. This is the current reality. It's an ongoing relationship of exploitation, expropriation. So my family migrated from Mauritius, where only last year an oil tanker crashed on our coast and released thousands of tons into our pristine reefs. And my mum, who lives there, and many others, who were already hit hard by the pandemic and the lack of tourism, were now made even further impoverished because people couldn't fish, local tourists couldn't come to the area, and kind of the local economy was devastated. This is very much, to my mind, the same asymmetry of power and relationship of extraction and destruction that we're speaking about when we think about how colonialism shaped these relations. It is the very same industrialists who turned plantations into prisons and who now use prison labor to put out wildfires. All these things are very much connected. The US government literally calls some of these areas that we speak about national sacrifice areas. And we have to ask ourselves, who is sacrificed? Who has always been sacrificed? And the answer returns that it's the global South and the global South and the global North. So these migrant communities that have settled in the global North. It's the peoples, their lands, their traditions. And this is climate catastrophe as I understand it. And Howard, feel free to stop me if I'm taking too much time, because yeah, I always do that. And this is where the role that racecraft and racism comes into play for me. And this is why the organization I'm part of, Black Lives Matter UK, teamed up with Hackney East in Newham. How many years ago was it? 5 years ago? Oh my God, getting old. 5 years ago, and we closed down London City Airport for the day. It makes it sound like we just came in and just locked the doors. We did a direct action. We occupied the runway. People laid their bodies across the tarmac and shut down the airport, and no planes were able to fly. And we caused hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds in losses, and brought the story to national attention. And what we're trying to highlight is that Newham, predominantly working class migrant community, should not be sacrificed for a new runway, and a new runway that will ultimately service frequent flyers. And those frequent flyers were earning 3 times the amount of a local resident. Now, these weren't people going on holidays. These are business flyers. That airport services that community. And we didn't really connect any issues at all. We we weren't like trying to bring together. And this is that thing that people are like, oh, you know, air pollution isn't racist. We're not trying to like connect anything at all. We're just trying to point and say that the climate crisis, the hostile environment, racism, these things, they intersect and depend on each other. They reinforce each other. And if we want to fight them, we have to fight them all at the same time. You know, our banner laid down across the tarmac read, the climate crisis is a racist crisis. And racism, for me, a definition that I came across recently that I find really useful when thinking about racism is one by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's an incredible geographer, an activist and scholar. She suggests that racism is the state-sanctioned, I don't know if I should say open quote. She says it's the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So it is the state-made vulnerability to premature death. And when you think about it like this, then actually all these forms of environmental affectation that happen where you like live close to some kind of toxic waste facility, all these climate catastrophes are so clearly racist because they do increase our vulnerability to death. And we can't abstract war, famine, migration, borders, racism, and climate change from each other. They are so completely interdependent. You know, like the Syrian civil war was ultimately, not ultimately, but was in many ways a consequence of environmental catastrophe because of a really severe drought that was brought on by huge clouds of pollution from Europe that then devastated the farmers. The farmers then had to move into the cities, and there was lots of social conflict that was going on. There was civil strife, there was the war. Like it was caused by drought, which was brought on by climate change, actually brought on by pollution in the West. And then the migrant crisis that we think about that happened recently, you know, the whole like when there was a period of all of us talking about the migrant crisis and Alan Kurdi, the body of the young Kurdish boy that washed up on the shores, and all this kind of new hype from the far right about us being invaded. That was about the Syrian civil war, right? That was about actually loads of Syrians coming to the West, and other countries responded differently. Obviously, our country, the rainy fascist island is, responded how we did, but all of these things are connected. And that's why for me, no borders must be part of the abolitionist demand in a vision for climate justice. Because this is very much, borders are very much the site of violence that connect all of these things we're talking about. How much time have I got, Howard?
I mean, you can speak for however much you want. I'm not going to stop
Cool.
you.
I don't want to speak for too long and bore you with my voice. But so kind of the question that comes to me then is like, why aren't we, if all these things are so clearly connected, and many people say this like choked up, but like I said, 30 years ago, this declaration was made. The question that kind of comes to my mind is like, why aren't we fighting this in that way then? Why aren't we fighting it in an intersectional way? Why aren't we talking about war and borders and talking about racism and climate? Why aren't we connecting the dots? And I was recently asked in an Insta Live with some young people, like the question was like, how can the gap between racial and economic in the discussions about climate change be bridged? And I said that like before we kind of think about the bridging, maybe it's good to think about why there's a division to be bridged at all in the first place. You know, at the same time as the People of Color Environmental Justice Summit that I'm speaking about, that 30 years ago, there was also the Brundtland Commission. And the Brundtland Commission was where we kind of got this new narrative around sustainability. You know, sustainability is a hegemony in the discourse around climate change. You hear it in your workplace, you hear it everywhere. It's the buzzword for how we think about tackling climate change. Sustainable living, sustainable development, that was touted as our way out of the climate catastrophe through a report that they made called Our Common Future. The reality is that there's always been a kind of war of stories, right? And state and business alliances have fought to set the narrative on climate change. And for the Brundtland Commission and for many similar commissions, the problem part of the story, where the problem lies, is shifted. And responsibility, which ultimately lies with the like I said, the oligarchs and plutocrats, the people who made the plantations that then became the prisons, that then became the prisoners who fight the wildfires, their responsibility disappeared. And at the same time, their historic responsibility is dissipated. And that's why for us at BLM UK, when we did that action at a city airport, one of the biggest things we were saying in our press releases and stuff was that actually, if you take a long perspective of the emission of greenhouse gases, if you account for Britain's contribution to greenhouse gases from a longer historical perspective, then actually Britain is the biggest per capita contributor to climate change. If you think about it in the historical sweep, and that's what we're trying to, as kind of activists and progressives who are trying to tackle these things, we're trying to always bring a historical and materialist analysis of what's going on. But of course, people were like, "Why are you talking about 400 years ago?" And we're like, "Well, actually, that's how they sound, by the way, when they try and do it. That's because actually the industrial practice we're talking about began then, right? That yeah, I don't need to go into that too much. And for what we're trying to do when we're saying those things, we're trying to talk about climate justice. And climate justice for me is the story and the framework that I always hold in mind when I'm thinking about how racism and climate change are connected. And in that story of climate justice, we're saying that climate change is not caused by greenhouse gases. It's more caused by fossil fuel extraction that cause greenhouse gases. And we're trying to talk about history, and we're talking about agribusiness and land devastation, mining and extractivism, militaries and war, and what mediates those processes, which in the story of climate justice is very much race, class, and gender, and the hierarchies that this creates in our society. And what becomes apparent when we look at who benefits from this environmental destruction, who makes decisions and who is harmed, it is the poorest, the racialized, and women, and often those who inhabit all three categories who benefit least and make no decisions but are harmed the most. So class, race, and gender exploitation facilitates all of this catastrophe. The final piece in the story for me about climate justice is that we won't resolve this by tweaking some things here and pulling at some things there and reforming some things over there. Like, legislative change is not going to stop this. We've tried for a very long time through legislative change, such a mouthful, to do that, and it hasn't worked. To achieve climate justice, we'll need to tackle climate change root and branch, and we need to tackle these destructive industries at the source. And to do that, it is the very people who are exploited in sweatshops, in mines, on farms, who will be the change makers. And there's no two ways around it, that it will be people in the global south that will be overcoming these violent relationships. And a lot of our work is to resource amplify their work. So the abolitionist vision for climate justice must be one on the basis of people power. For me, what I'm saying here is that we need to activate people power in order to be able to confront these industries and these very large alliances. And it must radically undermine the dependencies and relationships of racial capitalism. Abolition for me is a dream in motion, and history is not linear. And I read this thing yesterday when I was kind of looking at some stuff around abolition and climate justice, and it just made me think, like, I don't know, it was just useful for me to kind of think, wow, okay, like we're on a journey here, and we need to remember that it's always changing, because sometimes things feel so fixed. And it was like, I was reading about the penitentiary movement, which was so the penitentiary movement, penitence, they sought penitence, which is the notion that people can repent and be transformed. And the penitentiary movement were the people who advocated for prisons. And prisons were the radical reform that was being presented at the time. And when you think about what was being used, the kind of corporal punishment that was being used across Europe, the smallest crimes could result in death. For this movement, prisons were the, not the abolitionist reform, but they were the really progressive reform. And they won, and prisons were formed. But the nature of these prisons obviously changed over time. And, it changed. In Spain, you don't get more than 6 years for murder. Obviously, in America, you can still be on death row for murder. But it made me think that actually we're always on a journey towards this better thing. And like, prisons weren't always here. Prisons were almost a stopgap for us to be able to think about what can actually come faster and better than that. And so abolition is like, it's just, for us, it's like we have to pick up the baton and we have to continue this conversation, and we have to be pushing for more. That's really important. And that pushing for more means decision-making, production and distribution of food and energy must return to the hands of those who make and consume it. This is kind of like ultimately when we're talking about people power, redefining those relationships of exploitation and extraction. It means that the distribution and production of these industries that are kind of most responsible for climate change, food and energy, must return to our hands. And this means talking about sovereignty. And Alexandra, I'll end with a quote from Alexandra Kelbert's article, No Police, No Pollution, where she says, what keeps us safe in a climate just and abolitionist future? Question. Money in our pockets, good affordable homes, strong communities, food that is not only available but nutritious, clean air and water, equitable access to nature, time to care for one another. Yeah, and I'll end that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josh, for those thoughts. I've shared the kind of article that that you've mentioned in the chat bar if anyone is curious. It's a really great read. So now that kind of the speakers have said a bit about themselves and their work, kind of I guess we're moving on to like sort of the Q&A section where kind of Roshni and I will be asking some questions just to get the conversation started, and then we can kind of take questions from the audience and yeah, have a nice chat about kind of abolition, pollution, how they intersect and how we can sort of build a livable future. So I guess my first question is, so both of you have kind of said a bit about how you got started in kind of activism around like the environment and pollution. My question is, how have you seen the conversation shift since you started? And whether you think kind of questions about climate justice have been present in conversations about Black Lives Matter since its resurgence following the murder of George Floyd last summer, and like vice versa. Do you think conversations about racial justice are present sort of in the big uptick in interest around environmental justice that came with like XR last summer as well? So it's anyone can start off, but maybe either Nilati or Anjali, would you like to start since Josh has spoken?
Yeah, I can start. So personally, I think the environmental movement has been changing slightly. So I know that since we have like been set up as an organization, because we've only been around for about 6 months, a lot of the conversations that we've been having with people, we have been like with other organizations, we have been mentioning like race, and we have very explicitly been mentioning race. Like it's one of the main things that we've been talking about. And whilst we haven't found that many other organizations who are also talking about race and environment, like we've found other ones like Black Lives Matter and Wretched of the Earth who are doing similar things. But a lot of the organizations that we've been working with have not been discussing race in the same way. And whilst we have been seeing some, and it's great to be seeing that this is now a conversation that people are far more willing to have than they were a couple of years ago. And whilst there has been some development, I do still feel like the environment movement generally is quite reluctant to have this conversation and is focusing mainly on this from the perspective of like people in the global north, like white people in the global north who are privileged and don't want to see how other people don't have that same kind of privilege and how climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. And I think that people are very reluctant to have this conversation. And I think that one of the things that organizations who are having this conversation is forcing people to do is to actually examine that and examine how they are looking at climate justice and how they are talking about climate justice and what climate justice actually is. Because increasingly there have been more conversations that are saying, well, can climate justice exist without racial justice? Obviously the answer is climate justice is racial justice and racial justice is climate justice. But increasingly we are now having those kind of conversations. And I think that we need groups led by people of color to spark those conversations, because that's the only way they're going to ever happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, how has the conversation shifted since we started? I mean, around the time that BLM UK was formed, Wretched of the Earth was formed. And I think it was formed because like there was more space for it to be formed. And I think that, and there was more conversations around climate justice that were happening. And I don't think that that is the responsibility for those spaces being carved comes wholly from here. I think like actually, I mean, I think there's lots of things that shifted, but I think one of the things is like struggles that happen in places around the world because of social media and because of technology are able to spread like wildfire, and people are able to, you know, like maybe when Standing Rock happened, or the No Dapple pipeline happened, or the tar sands protest happened, these things that, you know, a lot of us here, if we're interested in climate activism, might know about. There might have been a time 20 years ago when we wouldn't really have found out about it as wide scale a way as we did because of technology. And I think that those struggles are part of the like growing conversation in climate justice, and climate justice being related to colonialism, and in those instances settler colonialism. So I think there's this constant pushing for space that's been happening, and I think like especially 30 years on from that summit, I would just want to say that actually it's been 30 years of constant agitation for this conversation to be at the top of the agenda. You know, we're just another step in that path, and we're just adding more like, you know, amplification to that conversation. So I feel like we've shifted it, but we've shifted it, you know, it's been shifting for a long time. And how it feels, but maybe just for me, because I'm like quite sometimes in a bubble with this stuff, but it feels like a lot of people who are coming to climate activism and who are coming to anti-racist activism are meeting it with material like today's talk. You know, they're meeting it they're reading authors, and they're watching activists, and they're like going to protests where people are making connections. Intersectional feminism, Black feminism is not like a fringe topic anymore. You know, like people at the World Bank are doing workshops around intersectional feminism. So like that means that actually this is an ascendant movement, and that's really important for us to know, because that means that there's a lot that we can tap into, latch onto, and there's lots of places we can push these conversations further. So it feels like it's in a good place. And you know, like a friend of mine has been going to the UN climate talks for 10 years as one of the people who was head of the delegation at Friends of the Earth. And when he started doing this work 34 years ago, it was really like you could really be trampled on, you know, you could really be pushed to the side of these conversations. And don't get me wrong, like people go to these conferences and do protests and they still do get sidelined, but not in any way like how they used to. Those voices from the Global South in particular are sought after. So we're in a good place, and I think we have to celebrate that as well. So yeah, I think that there's been, and I think specifically with BLM, it's always been at the forefront of our minds, you know, like it was a really important moment when BLM Toronto went to Standing Rock and like connected those dots around settler colonialism and racial capitalism in the US, and how those things are linked. Yeah, so I think we're in a very exciting place actually. And I think a lot of the kind of leaders of like the youth strikers, and this is not to say we don't have problems. We do have a lot of problems in the climate movement. It is probably the whitest movement of all the justice like activist progressive movements out there, to be honest. But I see a lot of change happening, and that's exciting. And I think we just need to keep taking space. So.
Thank you so much for both of your answers. And to kind of think a bit about what Josh was saying about technology and us actually knowing stories now that maybe we wouldn't have been able to hear in the past. Particularly, this is a question for Choked Up, but any answers would be really interesting, is well, we know in 2020 a coroner ruled that the death of Ella Adu Kissi Deborah was because of air pollution, and that's then sparked, I guess, the Choked Up movement as well. I guess, could you elaborate on the significance of this ruling for you and for air pollution to be put on the agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the landmark ruling in 2020 of the death of Ella Kissi Deborah and air pollution being recognised as a significant cause of her death was really significant because it officially recognised the dangers of air pollution, and it kind of gave the government and people no reason to ignore this as a really important issue and a really immediate issue in the lives of people of colour. And, you know, it provided more avenues for justice because, of course, Ella is not the only person to have died or who will die from air pollution. So it's really opened up and set a precedent for more families who lose loved ones to air pollution to get justice in the eyes of the law. And I think also importantly, it really gave a face and a name to the effects of air pollution to people who are affected worse by air pollution. So, you know, people who maybe would not have engaged in the conversation, seeing a 9-year-old die is quite a staggering thing to comprehend because of something that was completely out of her control, like breathing and where she lived. So yeah, it maybe increased white people's empathy or middle class people's empathy to the conversation and the debate.
Yeah, just building on that, I think that one of the reasons why this ruling is so important is because it directly holds the government accountable. Like, it's a court case against the government, which definitively proves that they were not doing enough to combat air pollution. And it shows the effects of that as well in a really clear way. And as Nialetti said, it put a face to this movement, and it meant that people were able to directly see the impacts and also kind of compare it to their own lives. Like, it was something that you could suddenly start thinking, oh, is this why so many kids in my year had asthma? Oh, is this why someone I knew like had really, really severe asthma attacks? Like, can I link that to something, to the location that they lived on, to the fact that they lived right by a busy street? And I personally know Ella's mum as well. And she was saying that increasingly they're getting calls from other people who also live in really polluted areas who are saying, hey, I think that that's why my husband died. Oh, I think that this is why my child has really bad asthma. And so it's becoming a bigger movement. And because of this one woman's work and because of her campaigning and her resilience, we're seeing that lots of these other people are following these avenues to justice and actually starting to understand what is happening in their communities in a way that they probably wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's truly amazing. And it's horrible what happened, but I really hope that some good can come out of this.
Yeah, thank you both. So kind of both of like Choked Up and Black Lives Matter UK kind of you guys have spoken about how your campaigns are quite rooted in community concerns. Like, for example, in 2016, Black Lives Matter UK, you worked with Hassan East to organize the airport shutdown, and Nialetti and Angeli kind of are mobilizing within your community to raise awareness about the effects of air pollution there. So I was just wondering how you see kind of your campaigns in relation to kind of wider struggles for justice in the global South. I mean, kind of like all of you have kind of touched on it, but I wondered if you could possibly expand and elaborate on, yeah, how you see yourself in relation to like movements in the global South. This is open to anyone.
I'm just thinking if you guys have anything off the top of your head, please feel free to go. But
Oh, okay, yeah. So obviously, air pollution is a major issue globally, and in the global south, this is an incredibly terrible issue as well. And our movement is kind of based on this as well, and like looking at it on an international like lens, because we know that a lot of countries like it's important to pressure them internationally as well, because otherwise places can easily ignore issues. Like if there is international pressure coming from other groups, and if we can see that like climate activists in other countries have been silenced historically, and if we're able to support and uplift them in ways that give them a platform and let them better express their own concerns about their lives, I think that we can really help them. And this is something that we're looking to do more, and something that we're definitely trying to engage more with internationally, and trying to extend our reach to help other people do similar things to what we're doing. And that's something we definitely want to do more in the future.
Yeah, and also to add to that, like maybe like a background to why we're like our history and as communities of color, and because of like migration patterns into this country, many of us have links to the global south, and that it's not something distant, it's very present for us as well. So
yeah, I think I'll follow on from what Nialeti was saying. And I think like those communities, you know, POC communities here, essentially migrant communities here, like we have those connections, but if we look at the history of struggle in those communities, particularly anti-racist struggle, that struggle was always anti-racist and anti-imperialist. Like that was always the case. They were internationalists. So the work that they were doing here was always connected to work that was happening there, because they see, like, as I said, there was the globe, these communities are the global south in the global north. And like Sivanandan, a famous activist from one of these communities, said, you know, we are here because they were there. So it was always at the prominent, it was always at the forefront of people struggling in this country, that these struggles are connected, and we need to be amplifying, as Anjali said, we need to be amplifying and talking about and understanding struggles in the other parts of the world. I think sometimes it is simply just like raising awareness or raising resources for these struggles in other parts of the world. I think sometimes it mean, you know, when we did the protests at the airport, one of the things we spoke about and put into our videos was a conversation around immigration and the hostile environment, because airports are sites of violence around sites of border violence, and people flee. And you know, the statistics are kind of overwhelming. Now, when we did that video, it was like, it's estimated that there'll be 50 million climate refugees by 2050. That was when we did the video. Now it's 200 million climate refugees by 2050. So even more and more, we're going to have to be talking about borders, migration, in the same sentence as talking about racism and climate change. And so, you know, we can be fighting against the hostile environment in our communities, and at the same time making connections to why people leave in other parts of the world and what happens at the border. And so I guess that's how we might be thinking about pushing and pulling in working at a local level, but thinking at an international level. And it's very important that we do that. Yeah, that's mostly what I think about that.
Yeah, thank you. And to kind of look at the idea of borders and institutions and structures, I want to ask, how can we conceptualize pollution like we do with police and prisons as a form of state-sanctioned racism, which places minoritized communities in closer proximity to harm and premature death? So how does this conceptualization shape your activism and your campaigning in your work? Be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think that it's incredibly alarming that a lot of this information about air pollution in London was concealed by the government. And facts about how school exposure was mainly in deprived communities, and how intense this exposure was the fact that that was concealed kind of shows that it is a deliberately state-sanctioned thing. And this is an explicit act of harm against these communities that the government was failing to act on. And I think that to describe it as anything other than state-sanctioned is to weaken its effects and to lie about how harmful it was. And so I think it's even more alarming that there's this expectation among people that people living in these communities have full autonomy and control over their own lives and can easily relocate to cleaner areas. So I know that we have had some comments about that saying like, if you live in these areas, why don't you leave and go somewhere else? And it's like, we shouldn't be expected to do that. We shouldn't be expected to change our lives for a better quality of air when this is something that we have no control over. And the other thing is that often the communities that are worst affected are safe places for people of color. So it's an area which is a cultural hub for people of that race. So you can find your food there, you can find people who share your experiences. It's a space where you feel safe, where you can connect with other people. And I feel like people of color are often forced to choose between two different safe spaces. Like they have to choose between being around people of their own race and being accepted into that community, or being in a place with clean air and a better environment that will not kill them. And the fact that we have to make these choices is an act of violence against us, because this is not something that we should ever have to choose. And we should never have to choose between a supportive community and breathing clean air.
And I think like the idea of to build on what Angie said, the idea of it being state sanctioned racism, it can be seen through the government deliberately concealing data about air quality in 2011, and even more recently, as we mentioned, with the Environment Bill being delayed, there really is no question that this is not something that the government or the state wants to tackle, as it could be damaging for their own interests. And it's just another way of perpetuating this hierarchy and oppression, I suppose.
It's a very good question. And I guess I don't really think about it as like how as a form of state sanctioned racism, but more like how does race and racism allow the state to sanction certain projects and certain industries and certain facilities and certain processes. Like, I guess I conceptualize it as, I guess I think about race and racism as processes over time, over geography, that facilitate and provide the engines for capitalism, colonialism, and for expropriation and for exploitation, for extractivism, and for the placement of, like I said in the talk, of toxic facilities, or the placement of prisons. Like, I just kind of, race and racism can kind of seem quite abstract for some people. Obviously, it's a lived experience for a lot of us, but it's also a way of understanding how the global setup happened and how it continues to work. So I kind of conceptualize it as how the state sanctions its projects more than anything else. And that kind of, and I always go back to that definition, because I think in your question you spoke about proximity to harm and premature death. I think racism is the increased vulnerability to premature death, and that could be at the hands of the police, but that could also be, as you guys have said, chopped up, like about air pollution. And it's just a myriad number of ways that we can be made more vulnerable to premature death. That could be flammable cladding in a tower, like in Grenfell, which of course has everything to do with your race and your class. So I guess I conceptualize it as a way of understanding why my family left Mauritius, why Mauritius is a tax-free haven, which allows for more, which facilitates more robbery from the African continent. Like why, how, like, yeah, why and how did these processes happen, and why and how do they continue to happen? Racecraft and racism explains a lot of that for us.
Yeah, thank you for those comments and thoughts. I'm just keeping track of time, so I think we can probably ask one more question from us before I guess we let the audience kind of chip in and ask some questions. So I guess I just would like to hear kind of what would a livable world where kind of every life is valued, where every life is protected, and where every life is nurtured look like to you? So kind of what do you think an abolitionist vision for climate justice would materially look like, and how does this vision shape your everyday practices as an kind of activist and as an organizer?
So I think a really important step to take first step to take would be reparations, and support for in the global south, meaningful support rather than just performative surface level reparations that only serve to benefit the global northern countries that have actually been contributing to air pollution and climate crisis. I think education about colonialism and climate justice really, and just us to really the basic needs such as clean air and safety from discrimination, I think, and oppression, and is really important to me as an activist.
Yeah, building on that, I think that education about colonialism and climate justice kind of underpins all of this, because at the moment, I think that most people don't understand how the two interlink. And I think that this is something that really has to change, because otherwise I feel that we can't really achieve anything. And what's even more alarming to me is the fact that like our government is actively trying to not let this happen, because they've literally banned they've basically banned including race theory in the curriculum, and have said that they don't want white pupils learning about white privilege. And I think that this is incredibly alarming, because I don't see how we're ever meant to achieve this kind of society where every life is valued and protected if we don't address the issues of racism and how some people in society just have more privilege than others. And we have to understand that, and we have to know what that looks like and know what that actually means in terms of real life. And I feel like unless we actually analyze that and unless we dig into that, there is no possible way that we can achieve a world where people of color are protected, because people don't understand what it is they need to be protected from. And so it's incredibly alarming that our government is saying stuff like this. It's incredibly alarming that they seem to be doing everything they can to combat this kind of future. Also, I think that we generally need more investment into local communities and local government, as without the funds to like actually make changes and actually having the power to make changes, how are local communities and local government meant to benefit the people who live there? And I think that we need to try and give power more directly to these kind of groups that understand what needs to change within these communities and actually what change looks like, because it's not going to look the same everywhere. There are certain issues that will exist in one place that won't exist in another, and there's certain funding that places will need that other places won't. And we have to understand that our approach to creating this world must be equitable and must account for disparities in people's means in what is actually existing within these places at the moment.
Those are really good answers. I'm just trying to think about what I could possibly add to them. It's a really hard question to think about, like what does it materially look like, that place? I think what Nialeti said about reparations feels incredibly important as part of the conversation. Maybe in thinking about the journey towards a climate just world, like in that journey towards a climate just world, reparations is absolutely the key to it. And reparations, not just in terms of how people might think about it in terms of like handing over resources. It's not necessarily about handing over. It's actually in many ways about an ending of things. It's about an ending. Reparations is an ending of neo-colonial relations. It's about an ending of debt regimes. It's about an ending of siphoning resources out of the global south. It's about the ending of structural adjustment programs through the World Bank and through that trifecta of institutions. It's about allowing places to be able to rebuild and build more, and movements to flourish and activists to not be killed. Reparations is a very big, broad, and very important part of the conversation around the Global Green New Deal. So that's kind of like maybe how we can begin to think about the journey towards that place. In terms of like, what's an abolitionist vision for climate justice? I guess for me, climate justice is an abolitionist vision. And maybe when we think about abolition and we're trying to think about what a world in where we've achieved abolition, maybe actually we can turn towards climate justice and actually get a lot from it, because climate justice is us saying that in order to be able to achieve a semblance of environmental justice, we have to tackle the roots of it. And so we have to have social justice. We have to have economic justice. And in doing so climate justice is about the ending of relationships of domination in the environmental sphere. So thinking about how we relate to nature and the relationships of interdependency that we need to nourish. And then it goes to social justice, and it says actually, in order to get climate justice, we need to end the relationships of domination that are powered by patriarchy, by white supremacy, and by capitalism and class capitalism. It's like, it's actually a whole new world we're thinking about in terms of climate justice. And so I think actually maybe climate justice is the abolitionist vision. But in terms of what it looks like materially, that's the great thing about this work, is that's going to be a surprise, and none of us would be a charlatan if we say any of us can say what it's going to look like. It needs to be emergent. I guess emergent is one of the kind of principles of a new kind of relationship we'd have with nature, allowing for emergence. But we're going to be building it, and we're going to be bringing that world forward. But what it looks like is absolutely, we'll see when we get there.
Thank you so much for all of your answers for our questions that we've given you so far. Now we're going to move on to a Q&A section of the event. So if you do have a question, please can you raise your hand using the function in Zoom where you click on participants and you can raise the little blue hand and we'll come to you. Or alternatively, you can put it in the chat and then we'll find questions that way. Whilst you have a think, I'm going to kick us off with a question that when I've been like reading about your work really kind of got me thinking, because I'm a history student and doing work around like America and thinking about space. A lot of the kind of national parks are, I think, racialized spaces, that these places of natural beauty are normally equated to also white and privilege. And you have to pay to get in, and the fee itself is also a barrier. So I guess my question is about the racialization of space and how yeah, natural beauty is equated to purity and white purity as well. If you have any thoughts on that, it'd be really interesting to hear.
Nothing's coming to my mind, you know, to be completely honest. I'm like, what?
Something that I think I would say is like we can see even we can see in the UK as well, like green spaces. There are more, it's harder to access a green space as a person of colour. There are less green spaces around where people of colour live. We can see that a lot of just the environment generally and being outdoors is something that has been very racialized, as you have said, and it's one of the reasons why I think a lot, well, actually no, and I think that it's something that really has to change, because currently we see environmentalism and we see like the environment generally as a very white thing when it really should not be, because it's something that affects everyone and affects people of color worse. And I think that that is deeply wrong, that something which should be open to everyone has been co-opted in this way and has been taken to mean something else and has been seized by white people and made highly inaccessible to people of color.
I think also, just to add to that, like I suppose that the idea of space being racialized in American parks is like a smaller, like a very contained level of example of what you see on a global scale. So the people who contribute most to this, to polluting the environment, are the ones who still do get to enjoy these spaces. So I think there've also been a load of studies in America that have revealed how little people of color contribute to air pollution or environmental problems in comparison to white people, but still experience the bulk of the negative impacts. Yeah, and also I suppose actually with like migration patterns and like where people of color tend to end up in the global north, like contained in very small areas where that are close to like industrial areas. It's just interesting how that's been kind of how that's been designed.
I had a quick point to make on that, which is an interesting thing to think about, because I like watched a lot of nature documentaries growing up, and I actually wanted to make nature documentaries, like one of my dream jobs when I was a kid. I was like, I want to be the Black David Attenborough. But I guess when we think about the imagination of like the great outdoors, it does feel very racialized. Like the narration of it, the presentation of it, who goes there, who's like what kind of people are seen in it and are able to tell the story of it, feels very racialized. I think there's actually a whole piece that I don't have the like learnedness to go on about, around like how the West kind of captured the imagination around what the outdoors is around and what nature really is, and that was part of like being able to conquest around the world, and the kind of names that they gave to parts of Australia and the Pacific when they colonized it, the changing of names. And actually I guess that kind of leads me on to the other thing, which is like what feels quite sad about all of that is like the severance of our connections to nature. And like growing up, it wasn't really a thing at all to go to, like with my family, to go out into nature, to go to a national park, or to go to even a park really. Whereas I know that was a thing for other like families, especially like, you know, middle class white families that I was aware of. They would go and they would have some kind of relationship to nature. And when I go back home, or if I've been in other parts of the world, there is like, when I went to Iran, there was like such a culture of like picnicking out in nature, and that felt really shocking to me. It was like, people of color out everywhere in parks and stuff. What the fuck? So I think the severance is really sad, and I think something is lost there. But I think in all of that, like we've still destroyed so much of our like ancient forests in this country, and the outdoor. You know, maybe it's racialized in that sense as well. Like it's actually completely expendable, and just seen as capital to people. So, you know, they still enjoy it, but they still actually destroy it as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're starting to get some questions in the chat bar, and I see some hands going up in the participants bar. So I'm just going to start going through them, and if we could each kind of, I guess, keep our responses brief, then hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them. So the first question is from Evan, who asks, from an abolitionist perspective, what do you see justice looking like for those affected by pollution / the climate crisis in general, in particular holding those responsible, be they governments, businesses, polluting communities, or CEOs of oil companies, etc., accountable for the harm they've caused beyond prisons and incarceration and yeah, all of that. So kind of what would accountability for the climate crisis look like to you? Big question, I realize, but hopefully we can get through that.
Like, I don't really want people to answer for their actions. Like, I don't really want to put anybody on trial. I'm not really bothered in what explanations people are going to give for why they continued some of the practices that we're talking about in this conversation. I'm more interested, and when I think about justice, I'm thinking about like, what is our relationship to what we create? Why don't we own what we create? Why aren't we part of the conversation and decisions around, like, what, for me, justice is about like a radical shift in democracy and a radical shift in ownership. And in many ways, it's about anti-capitalism. It's about like, you know, from each according to their ability, each according to their needs. Like, it's about building movements where people power is able to kind of capture real democracy, and where people in their workplaces actually have a say in what they're making all over the world. But I don't think of accountability really as like part of that journey for me. But maybe that's just where I'm at, and I'm not really, maybe accountability means something else to the person that was asking the question.
Yeah. Nilati or Anjali, would you like to add? Or if not, we can move on to the next question. Okay.
I would very quickly like to say that I think that, as Josh has said, I think that the best way to kind of look at justice is by leading it from the people who are most affected. And so kind of working on a way of trying to improve their lives after this, and well, also during it, and making sure that the way that we approach this is very victim-led and actively tries to help people instead of punishing others.
Thank you for those thoughts. I believe, Vanessa, you've had your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Anjali, I think you might have just answered my question, but I'm coming at this from the educational side of things. I'm a teacher, a new teacher, but a teacher of geography. I teach in Newham, so I teach in a school where the majority, real vast majority of the kids are like Black and minority ethnic students. I teach geography, and I've been really thinking about ways to teach climate change. And obviously, as we've discussed already, as you guys have said, and I think Anjali, like you made this point so powerfully, like the curriculum is rubbish. It's so conservative. It's not radical. It leaves no space for like radical, revolutionary, as you were saying, Josh, like an imagined potential. None of that. But what I'm thinking about, and what I would really like your perspective on, is like these kids that I'm teaching, as we've been discussing for the past hour and a half, they are the ones that are going to be most affected by climate injustice. I'm conscious of not putting the onus on them for dealing with this problem, because I actually think the problem, that the onus and like the responsibility should be put on the people who are causing the issue. But I want to make them, I want to help them see that this is going on, because right now it's not talked about, and climate justice and climate is seen through their eyes, as we've talked about Extinction Rebellion, and it's seen by my students as this like very white movement, which it is, and it's very they feel excluded from it, is the sense that I get. So I guess my question, or what I would like your perspective on, is like what role does education play in everything that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I think that, well, I'm really big for making sure that education is a priority, and making sure that education like reflects the urgency of the climate crisis, and the social justice aspects of it, and climate justice generally. So I get your issue, because trust me, as someone who's been through the education system on like for geography, I completely understand how bad it is on like teaching climate justice. And I also understand how hard it must be teaching those young people of color, especially when they can't see themselves reflected in these movements at all. So I think that, I don't know, I think one of the best things that you can do is like teach them firstly about, like, obviously you don't want to teach them about personal like change that they can do, like you want to in a way, but you also need to teach them about the systems of oppression behind these kind of injustices, because otherwise everyone has this wrong idea of what climate justice is, and they have this wrong idea of what climate change actually means and how we can actually fight it. And this is something that I've seen myself, like where people think that the best way to change it and the only way to change it is by using reusable water bottles, when like this is important, but it's not going to achieve much when 70% of emissions are from big corporations. So I guess stuff that you can teach them is firstly how important like system change is, and how important it is to actually do stuff to disrupt these systems of oppression, and how important that is in dismantling these systems and actually tackling this issue. And like I like showing them how people of color are affected by this, and how people of color should be and need to be at the front of these movements, and just showing them that even if they can't see themselves yet within these movements, how important their voices are within them regardless, and showing how it will affect them regardless, and they need to do something about it, like trying to mobilize them to actually take real action on it, and actually start doing stuff to tackle this crisis and start understanding it. That's basically all I would say. I understand that you're in a really difficult situation.
Just to add to what Anjali said, like you basically covered everything. I just to like reiterate, I think that it's really important to identify and emphasize that the majority of the pressure should not be placed on the individual for climate change and tackling climate change. And, you know, concepts like a carbon footprint, which I think a lot of people will know is, you know, it feels like a burden on you that you have to reduce your carbon footprint, or, as Angie said, use a reusable water bottle. I think that can be quite crippling in people feeling like there's no way that climate change can be limited or stopped, and there's nothing that you can do about it. So yeah, I think just like emphasizing the big systemic reason behind it might be useful.
It's funny because like the person who like really kind of politicized me was my geography teacher at well, from year 7 to year 12. He was also the person who was like most like rude. He like used to suspend me and exclude me a lot, but he was also like, he also really taught geography in a way that was accurate. Basically, when he spoke about globalization, he spoke about disproportionalities and who takes the lion's share of what of environmental destruction. And yeah, in hindsight, it was like, and I'd come home and I'd speak to my sister about it, and I'd be like, oh my God, did you know this stuff? Da, 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 da. And I remember like in hindsight thinking, damn, that must have been quite a lot for her. And she was like, yeah, you told me this stuff. And I was like, oh, this is so much, I don't know what to do with it. I think what I'd wish he'd done at the time, and that was a turning point for me, and learning about those things was a very important part in me kind of coming to terms with the world. What I wish he'd done as well, and what didn't happen until later, was that at the same time as talking about these relationships, he didn't kind of disrupt how we think about who has political agency and who has the ability to make a change in the world. You know, like when I talk about history and I talk about those relationships of extraction and dispossession and stuff, I always like to at the same time talk about people's history, like the fact that we got independence, anti-colonial struggles overcame imperialism all over the world. It's been 30 years since the Environmental Leadership Summit. We can go back and we can celebrate and lift up those times where people took political agency. And I think on one hand, when we talk about stuff, especially with like young people, it can be incredibly frightening and incredibly like, oh my God, this is a humongous thing. But at the same time, if we talk about people power, and if we talk about the successes we've had, it can activate their political agency in a way which actually is great, and it makes them feel like, actually, I feel I have a role to play. And I would say they have a role to play. I would say that actually we absolutely cannot rely on the people in power to be able to make those changes. So they do have a role to play. And I wouldn't ever say that like you have to be the person that does this, but it's for them to make that decision. You know, we can show them what these processes are. We can show them how people have taken power, and they'll make the decision at the end of the day. They'll be like, you know, actually, this is sick, but FIFA is calling me and I just want to play FIFA tonight. Or they'll be like, actually, I want to learn some more, and that's fine. So I think like, especially going to history, how we teach history alongside this stuff is the most important thing. And if we talk about people's history, and there's so many instances of being able to talk about it, and especially foregrounding people's history from the global south, thinking about writers from the Pacific, thinking about writers from native communities and how they talk about versions of history that we write about here. I think that's actually incredibly empowering. And I think it returns political agency to the people. So yeah, I think, yeah, good luck. I'm sure you're doing a sick job, and I'm sure you'll continue to do a sick job.
I'm aware it's 7:30, which is when we're scheduled to end, but if it's all right with the speakers, it'd be great if we could just take another question. So if it's all right, we'll go to Mariam.
Hiya, thank you for a brilliant talk. Been really interesting. I've sort of got two questions, but you can choose which one you want to answer if we don't have time. The first is, there's been a lot of activism on social media. And actually, I'd say a lot of what I've learned about climate justice and BLM has been from Instagram posts. And I'm wondering whether you think that is helpful, or whether it just gives a really shallow view of the knowledge, and whether you don't get a proper understanding of the problem. And the other question is something that someone brought up to me quite recently, which was that when groups of Extinction Rebellion talk about love for the planet, and that being their motivation for environmental justice, it alienates people who just do it for other people and who care about their communities. And I guess that's quite relevant for air pollution, because it's more about this 9-year-old who died rather than love for the earth and love for nature. And maybe how we can change the conversation around that to make it more inclusive. Thank you.
So I can answer your question, your first question about Instagram posts. I think it can be maybe a bit of a cop-out and very performative. Some of these Instagram posts, although they are quite informative, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Any type of way that information can be spread to people, people can be educated, I think is a positive thing, but I don't think that should be where activism ends.
Yeah, so slightly building on that point, I think something that I have been sort of alarmed by looking at Instagram posts is who's actually posting them. So often it's really big corporations who are trying to like greenwash or present themselves as more like woke, kind of, when actually they are not in any way, and they're built off of exploitation. So whilst I do think that Instagram posts can be a tool for good, and whilst I myself have loads of them on my feed and loads of them saved, I think it's really important to look at where you're getting your information from and who you're actually supporting by getting that information. And then touching on your second point, I think that opening up this conversation to talk more about people is one of the first steps towards actually making it more of a climate justice movement. Because I think that personally for me, as a person of colour, seeing how my community has been affected by it, and knowing that it's people like me who are mainly affected by climate change and by environmental issues, that's one of the biggest drivers for why I campaign on it. So whilst I truly do love animals and I love the environment, and honestly, like, I am obsessed with animals, I have been since I was a kid, and whilst I would have probably cared about this issue if it was just animals who were dying, I don't know if I would have been driven to campaign on it in the same way. So whilst I think that we have to have space in our movement for both of them, but I also think that we have to make sure that people understand that people are dying because of this, and that should be enough to campaign, and you shouldn't have to care about the environment in the same way to care about people and care that people are affected by this.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, like, I think Naila, you, Anjali, one of you like said it before, but like the more we speak about it from a framework of people, the more we're gonna build the movement and the more people can get involved in it. I think what was I gonna say? Yeah, I think more and more, I think climate justice is like always saying, and I'm just going to be repeating myself, but like the issues of war, issues of displacement, issues of migration are always connected to climate change. And so like it's an incomplete conversation if we're not talking about people and the movement of people and the violence that people face all over the world. Where the minds are placed, it's always about people, and especially as we you know, like, because the conversation around mining is going to be changing even more as we talk about, like, you know, like lithium batteries and what powers solar panels, and actually where a lot of these mines are going to be placed. But I think, yeah, I think it has, and I think that conference that happened 30 years ago was about foregrounding people. I think we're just always going to have to be pushing for that narrative. And there's always going to be a contestation, because there's always going to be NGOs that want to make it about what are those bears called again? Polar bears. Yeah, they're always going to want to make it about polar bears, and we're always going to want to make it about communities that live around those animals. And yeah, so I think that's always going to be a struggle. On the activism on social media, I feel like it's really important that that happens, and that people get activated through social media, and that people see those cards that are misquotes of like people like that are just totally wrong, or how they've taken something out of context. And I think because that is just where a lot of politicization is happening. And I think what's kind of more important is like, how are we being in those spaces and taking people on a bigger journey, which is what Nilay talk about, which is like this there's this amazing activist scholar called Robin Kelly, and he's amazing. He has lots of good books. Freedom Dreams is a really good one if you want to get inspired. And he was doing a conversation recently, and he spoke about how on his top drawer he keeps these 3 words every day. He looks at them and it reminds him of what he's supposed to be doing, and it's love, study, struggle. And the love part is like, how can we make our daily practice, how can we make justice not just a place we're going to, but part of our daily practice? How can we change our relationships with each other and with the world and with work to one of love, one of compassion and care and healing? And study. I think like actually our calling, all of us who choose to do activism, is that we have to study pretty hard. You know, we have to self-study, and we have to take ideas, and we have to be the watchword is curiosity. We have to stay eternally curious. We have to not, even when something sounds super progressive, like, oh, this guy said that, you know, revolutionary love and love every day is a way that we change our relationships. We should say, that sounds cool, but I'm going to actually go and read some more about that, and I'm going to see other perspectives. We have to be vigilant. We have to study. And so we can so where people start to study, if that's a thing on social media, we should always be there trying to take people on a journey. And that's a big part of BLM UK's work, is education and thinking about it in a programmatic way. Any movement that's going to be building in a meaningful way has to do education in a programmatic way, and consciousness raising is a really important part of what we do. This is why Angelina, Letty, and myself are here. We're trying to raise our own consciousness and collectively raise our consciousness in thinking about these ideas. But I think actually sometimes when we think about social media, it's like, sometimes I can hate on it, especially on influencers that are just making bare money off of like chatting about topics that they don't know about and who are accountable to no one, and it really pisses me off. But at the same time, that is just where a lot of stuff happens. That is where a lot of people came to BLM UK. Those black boxes were really annoying when corporations done it, but they activated a lot of people. And we just need to be there, ready to catch people when they're like on board of this stuff. We got to be there to give them more.
Thank you. I think on that note, we will end the discussion there. But thank you all so much for your insightful responses and interesting questions. This is there's a lot to reflect on, and this was quite an energizing and kind of nourishing discussion that I think we'll all definitely be thinking about and hopefully carry forward. We want to thank our incredible speakers one last time. Thank you all so much for taking the time to come speak with us. To stay engaged, you can obviously follow all of our speakers on social media. I kind of also want to take this moment to plug the other events that we have coming up this week, particularly our discussion group on Sunday, where we're going to be like reflecting on all the events that have happened this week and thinking about how we can actually build an anti-racist climate justice movement in our university. So thank you all for coming, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much for putting it on.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Phil. All right.